they'd just vote against what women wanted, probably, and it would be disastrous to business and everything else. And it was uproariously funny. I remember the laughter of the audience more than I remember what was being said, because she had really made a caricature of Sir Rodman Roblin that would be pretty difficult to repeat. And it had such an effect that it was said afterward that it had more to do with the defeat of the Roblin government when they went to the province the next year. That was in 1914. 1915, the government was defeated, and in Mr. T.C. Norris, who was a friend of my father's, one of the first bills they put through in 1916 was the enfranchisement of women in Manitoba, and Saskatchewan, of course, became a province, to become a province in 1905, and that they followed with their legislation the next year. So Manitoba women, Saskatchewan next, were the first women in Canada to be enfranchised, and the first for most of the continent.
In the Second World War, women's role expanded. Between 1941 and 1945, more than 46,000 women served overseas in a variety of traditional and non-traditional military roles. Some women were assigned to coastal defenses, and some flew planes across the Atlantic in ferry command. The need for a larger labor force increased as factories began to operate 7 days a week, with 12 hours a day the norm. As men left vital jobs to go off to war, there was a dramatic increase in the number of women in the workforce. In 1942, the federal government established the National Selective Service, NSS, to recruit as many women as possible for wartime work. At first, the NSS recruited only unmarried women between the ages of 20 and 24. By 1943, all women were being encouraged to do their patriotic duty. Women also played an important role in working side by side with the men who had remained on farms to produce food for the war effort. Their contribution was evident as Canada shipped 90 million bushels of wheat to Europe in 1942 alone. Women in the Second World War challenged traditional attitudes about the roles women should play in society. They participated in the armed forces for the first time, and governments actively recruited women to work in war industries at home. Yet, women both in the military and at home continued to be paid less money than men for the same work. Despite the apparent return to pre-war attitudes, there were some signs of changes in attitudes towards women and their role in society. Elizabeth McGill, also known as Elsie McGill, was brought up in a well-to-do household but suffered from polio as a child and was permanently disabled. Yet she did not let disability or her gender interfere with her success in a career that, in the 1920s, was considered men's work: aviation engineering. In 1923, McGill was the first woman to graduate in electrical engineering from the University of Toronto. In 1929, she gained a graduate degree in the new field of aeronautical engineering from the University of Michigan. By the late 1930s, she was the chief aeronautical engineer for the Canadian Car and Foundry Company. Throughout her career, McGill followed in her mother's footsteps as an active feminist. In the 1960s, she was president of a national organization of women's clubs. She was also a key member of the Royal Commission on the Status of Women. As well, she was a founding member of the National Action Committee, the main lobby group for women's rights in late 20th century Canada. Elsie McGill would have been an honored Canadian for her pre-war and wartime accomplishments alone. Yet her influence has lived beyond her death in 1980 in the commitment of other women to carry on her campaign for women's rights. During the war, many Canadian soldiers married women overseas. Most war brides were from Britain, but some were from countries that Canadian soldiers had helped liberate. There were even some from Germany. Altogether, almost 50,000 war brides and 22,000 children came to Canada after the war. These experiences were as varied as the cities, towns, and farms where they settled with their new husbands and often young children. The role of women in Canadian society has expanded all through the 20th century. Women became more widely involved in politics, higher education, and the workforce. During both World Wars, women had played important roles in the military and on the home front. By the 1960s, new laws and more liberal attitudes towards women's roles in society encouraged women to demand equal rights and recognition. The status of women became an important issue in the 1970s. The Royal Commission on the Status of Women was created by the Pearson government in 1967 in response to pressure from women's groups. They wanted a complete reassessment of the status of Canadian women. The commissioners received submissions from every province and territory. Some submissions supported traditional views. Most submissions reflected a new view of women and society in which women had the right to choose whether or not to work outside the home. There are also a growing belief that childcare was the joint responsibility of parents and society. Although 1 million more women entered the labor force between 1960 and 1970, the percentage of women in management rose only from 3.7% to 3.9%. There were 134 federal and provincial elections between 1917 and 1970, in which 6,778 men and only 67 women were elected to office. In 1972, there were 5 female MPs out of a total of 264. Although 8 of 10 provinces had equal pay laws, women were still paid less than men, even when doing work of equal value. In Halifax, the average weekly salary for female clerks was $71, compared with $106 for men. Two-thirds of all welfare recipients were women. The Royal Commission recommendation included maternity benefits for working women, a national network for daycare centers, equal pay for equal work, employment insurance system and the Canada Pension Plan, prohibition of discrimination on the basis of gender and marital status. After the Royal Commission report was issued, a number of new women's organizations appeared. In 1972, many of them formed a new umbrella organization, the National Action Committee on the Status of Women, NAC. The NAC added a powerful new voice to the women's movement. It pushed for the implementation of the Royal Commission report and united many of the diverse women's groups across Canada. Its wide appeal to Canadian women is suggested by the range of political affiliations of its leaders in the 1970s. Laura Sabia was a conservative and women's rights advocate, and Grace Hartman was a left-wing NDP member and union leader. The NAC and other women's groups had some success. During the 1970s, the availability of subsidized daycare increased. employers became more aware of equal pay laws. After 1978, the child tax credit was introduced to help supplement family allowances of low-income families. The United Nations declared 1975 to be International Women's Year. UN International Women's Year 1975 goals: to promote equality between men and women, to ensure the full participation of women in all aspects of national and international life, to inform and educate the general public about the changing attitudes towards women's roles in society. In Canada, there was a round of conferences, rallies, and celebrations of women's contributions to society. There may not have been much concrete legislation passed to meet women's needs, but Canadians become much more aware of women's issues. By the end of the 20th century, women had made considerable gains compared to earlier in the century. By the 1990s, women held office at all levels of government. Jeanne Sauvé became the first woman Speaker of the House of Commons in 1980. In 1984, she became Canada's first female Governor-General. Kim Campbell served as Prime Minister, although for only a short period, in 1993. The federal NDP party has had two female leaders since 1989, Audrey McLaughlin and Alexa McDonough. In some university professional programs, such as law, where there had previously been very few or no women, women now outnumbered men. By the end of the century, it was clear that women enjoyed greater levels of equality than their predecessors. In many other less visible ways, women did not enjoy equity with men. Women's wages were still lower than men's by 28% on average. As well, many women were still bumping into the glass ceiling, an invisible barrier that kept women from the best jobs. In the 1980s and 1990s, women were adversely affected by funding cuts. Women held more civil service jobs than men, especially in nursing, healthcare, and social work. Women who lost their jobs also had to contend with cuts in employment insurance benefits and welfare. Daycare was a continuing problem, especially for single mothers. Despite promises by both the provincial and federal governments, adequate numbers of publicly funded daycare places were not provided.